Hello everyone, this is Professor Reha here with another class examination, this one being the Blademaster, which is specifically the combination of Soldier and Nightblade. Now this is a fairly odd combination for me personally because there's so much potential, but it all feels so very restrictive, at least to me, where you have to invest a really substantial amount of points to really get a specific build across. And I'm going to give you an example of one of my favorite builds, the Soldier-Nightblade combination. Slaps points into the full cadence, at least the fighting form for that bleeding damage. I typically go all the way to deadly momentum for extra bleeding, and then you slap in your dual blades, and then you go all the way to Begothian's shears. You get Nadala's hidden hand. You get all of this. You put all your points here. And then you go into Olorin's Rage, and then at this particular junction you're looking for an AoE, so you go into Blade Arc for that delicious bleeding damage, because everyone loves to bleed. And then maybe you're going to go into Decorated Soldier, splash a couple of points in Menhir's Will just to at least help keep you alive a little bit longer. Now, if you're wondering to yourself, what's the point? Absolutely massive amounts of plain old auto-attacking goodness. Consider that you have, well, an alternative would be Vitality Bleeding, but there's not really any Vitality going pure here, so that's kind of your choice, ultimately. But you're looking at some enemies saying, you're gonna die in 2 seconds, and hitting them with just an absolute spasm of everything, and then they just die, basically. Now, again, the problem with this is that just getting all Cadence, all Blade Arc, Olorin's Rage, and the dual blades, you have one activatable ability, you have a couple of passives. It's like, okay, that's a lot of points for that. It is a very, whatever way you build with this combination, there's not much splashing that gets done, unlike the other two classes where you can kind of mix and match. You're either, like, fully committing to a build, or you're committing 100% of your points to a build, or you're not really doing this right. Is kind of the feeling that I often get when playing this combination. Now, don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean that you can't play around and mix and match. It's just fairly expensive, both point-wise and bits-wise, if you're doing this improv. So there is that whole issue there. Whether or not that bothers you is completely up to you. It depends on your feelings. But there is some interesting, I would say, conflict here, because unfortunately all the damage boosts for Nightblade don't really mesh too hot with Soldier. Consider this, for example, Anatomy of Murder. You've got bleeding damage, delicious. Vitality damage, great. Everyone loves it. Now the problem here is that the Soldier doesn't do any vitality damage. Yes, there is some bleeding damage. Like I said, you can get to fighting form and potentially deadly momentum if you really want to, and you have Blade Arc / Laceration. Fine. But the Nightblade doesn't, I mean, you've got your Phantasmal Blades which do bleeding damage, but beyond that, there's piercing and there's bleeding here, which is fine, but there's no vitality there. You have this which does cold piercing, and then it goes into poison with more points, and then at the end here it does vitality, but it doesn't bleed. And then over here you've just got cold and acid. You can see where there's not really a ton of overlap here. I mean, there's nothing wrong with going into Anatomy of Murder, going into Phantasmal Blades as your ranged attack, and then you could do Frenetic Throw if you really wanted to. That's entirely up to you. And then going into, well, honestly, at this point you really wouldn't want Nether Edge. There's no benefit there. Going into at least Heartseeker, and then grabbing good old Blade Arc and Laceration for your AoE, and probably Cadence as well for your quote single target damage. So that can be fairly effective, but then a lot of any other skills you really want to splash into aren't going to take advantage of Anatomy of Murder. And of course, the Nightblade doesn't have much in the way of pure physical. Actually, I don't think they have anything that's pure physical. Unless your weapon just, there's Begothian's Shears, so there is that. But there's not a whole lot of straight-up damage crossover. Again, another example would be Merciless Repertoire. You have the increased retaliation damage, but that's the only benefit Soldier can gain out of that. You might throw on Counter-Strike and then basically you walk away. There's really nothing else you can do with that. So it is a little bit tough to get this to mesh really well. Like I said, Cadence with dual blades is one of my favorite ways to play this, because first off, I don't really have to think about it. and I don't have to try and coordinate things. This does, again, depend somewhat on what items you wind up getting, or the items you already have, because that can potentially change the damage type of some specific ability over to something else, which changes how you would build to some extent. But this is not necessarily a combination that meshes as well. Unlike the previous two classes where there were a lot of different interesting ways you could get things to flow really well, there are two really well-flowing builds, which again is namely dual blades full, cadence full, or at least dual blades mostly full, cadence to at least fighting form. With Nightblade, you at least want to go to Belgothian's Shears, because past that it's really a potential issue of damage types, because if you at least go all the way to Belgothian's Shears, you get that bonus physical damage, and then you can boost that with Decorated Soldier and Oleron's Rage if you really wanted to. And of course you get the pierce damage increase there, and Nidala's Hidden Hand is then a choice. Do you want to go into this and lose some of your piercing damage or not? So you don't necessarily, if you really don't want to go all the way, but if you want to make this work effectively, you at least want to go to Belgothian's Shears, because you're going to get that pierce damage, you're going to get that physical damage that you can enhance or not, as you choose in the future. Now, if you are going to be fairly dedicated, if you are going to use any kind of potential shield, if you are going to go with a shield at all, I would recommend not going for Blitz in an unusual twist, and instead go for Force Wave, because that actually picks up pierce damage, which you can in fact benefit from in some way. You can actually go into Oleron's Rage, and then dedicate yourself pretty hard to, you can do probably just straight Phantasmal Blades would be fine. At this point you're kind of losing just Phantasmal Blades if you really wanted to, but again, if you have Force Wave, you won't necessarily want that. Let me see. I don't really think there's anything else. Well, there's Knight's Chill, but that's okay. You could, if you really wanted to, go into... Yeah, there's really not a whole lot you do here. You could go into Knight's Chill for the Pierce drop, and then just go into Amarasta's Blade Burst as your AoE. And then you might go into Merciless Repertoire, you might not. You could pull this all the way back, as an example. Oops, not back far enough. There we go. You could go into Merciless Repertoire, go into Oleron's Rage, of course, Counter-Strike for some delicious retaliation damage, and get that fairly effectively, and then at that point, the world's your oyster. But there's still... It's not perfect. You're still not enhancing the Amarasta's Blade Burst, because even though it's self-enhancing, which is great and all, you're basically then just trying to spam this whenever you come up against a group of enemies, and then the rest of your time you're using Rending Force to stun, and it just gets very odd, because basically you're just Force Wave, Amarasta's Blade Burst, Force Wave. Okay, is everyone dead except for a single target? Cadence, 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 cadence. I mean, it's interesting. But while there's a whole bunch of things that can slightly benefit each other, at the end of the day, nothing's going to be fitting quite as perfectly, except for possibly Blade Barrier, which is a beautiful thing for this combination, and probably the one thing I would recommend you almost always build here, if you're going with a Retaliation build. If you're not going with a Retaliation build, that's an entirely different question. Blade Trap can also be fairly effective. You generally aren't going to go into Devouring Blades unless you really are going... Unless you go into Anatomy of Murder, in which case it might be worth it. There is extra pierce and bleeding damage here. It's very odd. Blade Trap, I would actually come out and say, this is nice. Beyond Blade Trap, it's basically your choice. And it really, essentially, any combination can work well, but not awesome. There's not like any kind of really effective that's me just throwing stuff around, don't worry about it. There's not any kind of one build that flows really well with itself. But if I had to name some skills that were really effective, you know what, we'll just put the points in Devouring Blade just because I'm bold. And Phantasmal Armor is always good, regardless. I don't care what you're building. Phantasmal Armor is really, really nice. If you walked away from Nightblade just with these two skills and then you focus the rest of the time on Soldier, that would work. That would be fine. You could get Anatomy of Murder if you really wanted to. Again, totally up to you. But it is something of an interesting... You have a lot of choices when you build this combination. And again, if you get a particularly good piece of equipment that changes the damage type of one ability to something else, that will likely change how you build. But this is definitely one of those combinations where I would actually say, have at least a really good idea of what you want to build into. Have equipment for this. With the previous two builds, with the Commando and the Witchblade, you could make an extremely effective build regardless of what equipment you have, but this combination almost requires some piece of equipment to make this really effective, to bring it to that next level. This is not one of my favorite combinations to play, despite the fact that it is extremely damaging. This is one of the more damaging combinations in the game, because you can actually absolutely slap down, you know, like I said, you can go the full 9 yards with Execution, throw Cadence in there, and absolutely decimate pretty much anyone. Even, you don't even necessarily need an AoE ability, because you throw Cadence on here, right? You throw Cadence in, you get Fighting Form, that's a 2-3 target maximum depending on its level, you get some extra physical damage with Deadly Momentum, you go all the way with Dual Blades, okay, so maybe you get some extra damage there. Now suddenly have another 3 target random hit, we have this for more damage, we have this for more damage, we have this, which is an 8 target maximum, and then we have this for percentage of health damage. And then you just absolutely decimate everyone, and then you use Warcry for percentage of health around you, or at least a health reduction. You get a taunt in there, and then you terrify the enemies, so that way they can't kill you as easily. You know, they're too busy running around like maniacs. Maybe you even want to reduce their physical resistance, which with this particular build you would really want to, and then you clean up with some Olorin's Rage, and you go into Menhir's Will, or possibly Decorated Soldier, depending on how tanky you... Depending on whether or not you want to... Oh, I'm sorry, you don't... If you're using dual wielding, you can't use Menhir's Will. Pardon me, I forgot about that. In that case, you go into Decorated Soldier and Military Conditioning, or you just go all into Military Conditioning, possibly Scars of Battle. Or you could go into Phantasmal Armor, which is really nice as well. You could do that. You know, put 5 points into Phantasmal Armor, just for that little bit of boost in your armor. But you can see where this can absolutely hit like a steam engine. But again, that's very point intensive, and it kind of locks you in. But it is an interesting idea to use regular... If you want the absolute simplest to use build, that's it. You just hold down left click. Every once in a while, you shout at people. And that's all you need to do. It's super easy. It's fairly high risk, because you are basically going 100% into attack. There is the Terrify on Warcry, but that only works on the regular enemies. If you're against a boss, any kind of boss or any kind of hero, you're basically trying to kill them before they kill you. That's what it basically comes down to. And your itemization is also going to affect that. So this is definitely one of the most potentially damaging combinations you can play. This is the most damaging class combination you can easily play, but then comes the issue of you have to have the right items to really make that work, to either keep you alive, have some items that'll help you survive in some way, shape, or form, or otherwise you're just basically gonna roll over and die if you don't kill them before they kill you. That's the real problem here. And that's the main reason I'm not super fond of this build. Now, yes, you can build this with shields. I've done it before, and it can be quite effective. But again, there's always this feeling of, this could be better. And again, that does depend on your items. Sometimes you'll have the items that really makes... Sometimes you'll pick up an item, and you will see the build right there with this combination. You will see it. And that's fantastic. That is an amazing feeling. And this is the class that I usually have that with, where I will pick up an item and boom, I see a complete build with that item, just focused around that item. What I call a thematic, that's what I call thematic improv, where a specific item increases specific skills and changes one of these skills to do some other kind of damage, and then I build around that one item, or potentially that one set. That's what I call a thematic build, where a thematic improv. Now, unlike a lot of other players, I'm actually going to take a moment here because there's not really anything else I can say about this combination. I've said everything I need to about the combination, but I do want to take a moment to talk about the thematic build, where unlike a lot of other players who are like, okay, at this level you put these points into this skill up to here, and then you move on, you do this, that, and the other thing, you put these specific attributes in. I never play like that. I don't like playing like that. But I will absolutely build around an item or an item set, in which case they usually an item or a set will increase 2 to 3 skills in most cases. And in that case, other than making sure I have those skills, the rest of the leveling up is entirely up to me. And this combination is really good for that. I really love a lot of the thematic builds that I use for this combination, but I don't usually do either a directed improv or a full improv with this combination, because I'm not necessarily guaranteed to have the items to make this push this to the next level. This is probably the combination I take into the Shattered Realm the least, despite its insanely high damage, for that reason. Unless I have a themed build, I don't usually play this. And you will not see very many full improv or directed improvs of this combination, if any, from me, because it's just not a combination I'm comfortable doing any sort of improv on, personally. Now, if you want to take on that challenge, at the very least, don't make this your first improv. It's a nightmare to improv, and this should not be your introduction to improving in Grim Dawn. Just don't, please. Do an improv on one of the other two class combinations. The Witchblade is great for improving. The Commando, the Commando is particularly good for improving because you can really switch between skills fairly easily. Those skills coordinate quite nicely. I really like full improving the Commando. Witchblade is a great directed improv if you wanted to splash into that with that combination. That's fantastic. Blademaster, get a themed improv here. Either pick a single item or pick a set that is specifically for this class combination and build around that set. That's a really fun time. And when you pick up an item for this combination and you read the stats on that item, you will see, in most cases, the build just kind of forming up in front of your eyes. And the kind of thematic build that I would create versus what you would create would be different, because other than sharing the skills that item enhances, we would very likely take it in different directions. So don't ever feel like a thematic build is going to be generic or that everyone else has done, because there'll be some similarities, obviously, in that particular item being equipped, and the skills that particular item or set increases will obviously be present in your build, and they would also be present in mine, but beyond that, the other skills we pick to support that would very likely be different unless we're clones, in which case, hi. So, with that being said, I did want to just kind of delineate that out and just talk about the 3 kinds of improv that I usually play. Full improv, which was my first walkthrough, directed improv, which I'm currently running through with the Pyromancer class, which I'll cover later on in this series, and finally, the thematic improv of Blademaster, which is generally where I take this. With that being said, thank you all very much for joining me, and if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, leave them down in the comments below. I do read them. If you liked this, please like and subscribe if you didn't ignore me. And have a great 24 hours.